Hi, everyone. This is James Brohl. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, and I'd like to welcome Professor Bryan Caplan. Bryan is professor of economics at George Mason University, also a New York Times bestselling author, and he happens to be a former teacher of mine as well. I sat through both Bryan's PhD micro and public choice classes, and I can honestly say he's one of the best teachers I've ever had. And it's worth
You,
enrolling in the
James.
PhD program just to sit through Bryan's class because it's truly a riot. I'd also like to welcome Patricia Patnode, my colleague from the Mercatus Center. Patricia and I both recently read Bryan's recent book, Don't Be a Feminist, Essays in Genuine Justice, and that's what we're here to discuss today. Welcome, Bryan.
Asked you to be here.
Great. So I figured in honor of chivalry, I would let Patricia ask the first question. So Patricia, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks. Um, so Bryan, I'm sure you're aware, econ Twitter, and like the field of economics has had a very turbulent week with a lot of different Me Too allegations against different people in the profession and like criticism of how things are handled overall by the different institutions. And the dissatisfaction with some of the power imbalances in the field that may lead to the conditions for women to be sexually harassed. I believe in your book that you mentioned it would be, although you make the case for not being a feminist, that it could be permissible to identify as a feminist in a country like Saudi Arabia, where women are broadly treated as less valuable than men. Would it be appropriate for a woman in economics to identify as a feminist because they feel like they are in a similar situation where they're treated as less valuable and their opinions and experiences are not being accounted for by the institutions they're having to deal with every day?
Right. So I would say you should never identify as a feminist based upon how you personally feel, because feelings are not a way of figuring out truth. The first thing you need to do is calm down and put your feelings aside, and then see, is it really true that the accusations are in fact accurate? But just to back up, I mean, whether or not you should identify as a feminist, of course, depends upon what a feminist means. This is the first question that I deal with in the essay. There is a very common view that feminism is just the view that men and women should be treated equally. This is one that you can see in a lot of dictionaries, Wikipedia, and yet, as I point out, there's just no way this can be a correct description of the way people use the English language, because the vast majority of people who say they are not feminists also believe that men and women should be equal. All right, so then a lot of what I do in the book is say, well, what would a reasonable definition be? And yeah, just going back to what you're saying about Saudi Arabia, I say that the definition that fits actual use is something along the lines of feminism is the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. And then if you accept that, which I think it's a very close, at least to how people really use the word, it's one where almost all feminists, of course, do believe that our society treats men more fairly than women. And out of non-feminists, at least there is doubt about whether that's true. Right. But anyway, once you've got that definition down, then you can go and look at the facts on the ground and see what's really going on. My view is that economics today, on balance, I think that men are treated less fairly than women. Does not mean that for any individual case this is so, but that would be where I'm starting. I don't actually know any of the details of the accusations. I do think that there's a strong tendency for the accusations to be exaggerated and unfair, and also just to ignore the possibility of honest misunderstandings. So when the early Me Too scandals came out over Roland Fryer, so I do know the facts of that case, and I think he was treated very poorly indeed. But it was one where I thought that economists just lost sight of some of the main things that we've known, which is that first of all, if you treat one set of accusations as just being almost certainly correct, then this creates strong incentives for people to overstate, to exaggerate. It makes people remain silent in the face of these accusations because they're afraid. And then you get a very distorted picture of what's going on.
Are you confident that George Mason University is doing everything it can to make women feel safe in its academic environment and students?
I guess
I
I'm
know
confident that it's
GMU
not
has
doing
been.
everything, because that would require that the only thing we do is try to make women feel safe, which is a crazy high bar, right? If every day, every minute, every day, you say, look, we don't have any time for math. We don't have any time for economics because we just need to do everything that we can to make women feel safe. I would say, well, first of all, at minimum, you might say, well, what can we do to make people feel safe? Even that, of course, is a crazy high bar. That's what I thought was terrible about so much COVID policy is there's an exclusive focus on protecting people from COVID to the neglect of every other goal in life. How about having time with friends? How about getting to go with shopping or getting to enjoy vacation? Right? These are all things that are also valuable. And a reasonable person would balance these rather than say there's only one thing that matters and we'll max it out. But yeah, the bottom line is I don't think there's any school in the world, there's not a single human being who does everything they can to make women feel safe. And thank God, because otherwise that would be pretty much the end of any kind of a normal life.
You chose to dedicate the book to your wife and your daughter, and you structured the first essay in your book as a letter to your daughter, giving her advice not to be a feminist. I'm curious why you chose to make that dedication and to structure that first essay that way.
Right. Well, obviously, they're the two most important women in my life. And since the book was called Don't Be a Feminist, that was on my mind. In terms of why the first letter is called Don't Be a Feminist, a letter to my daughter, I will say the main reason I got really interested in this was when I had my fourth child, which is my first daughter, about 10 years ago. And very quickly, I did start thinking, well, what am I going to tell her about feminism? Right. I do know that based upon her demographics, if no one intercedes, then probably she will be a feminist because it's the standard view for young women in her social class. At the same time, I knew that I had a lot of doubts about the view and thought that it was much less intellectually defensible than most people do. But yeah, I spent about 8 years writing this essay in my head. And the primary motive of the essay really is just to stop my daughter personally from being a feminist. If the book sells no copies, no one else likes it, if I just stop her from being a feminist, I'll consider the book to have been a tremendous success. It's like, oh, I spent like a month of my life and I avoided this unfortunate outcome, in my view. I did want to go and write it this way because, obviously, I love my daughter very much. My goal in writing this is not to oppress her, it's not to mistreat her. Rather, it is to go and have a real, honest conversation with her. The way that I begin the book is by saying, look, you know the kind of parent I am. And that's the kind that you can go and ask me an honest question. I'll give you an honest answer. Right. And I thought that this was a good topic to do that on. Because I think really there's so much fear involved in the conversation that it's hard to really have it. But I've got tenure, so I thought I would stick my neck out. And so that's what I did.
So I also have a daughter who's in first grade. And I kind of think if I were to write a letter to her like this and dedicate to her, I might say something like, even if you don't necessarily agree with all these views, it's in your self-interest to kind of go along with them. It'll help you get ahead. Later on, maybe when you're more established, you can kind of abandon the ideology if you want. What do you think about that kind of strategic perspective?
Yeah, so I actually talk about it in the essay, and I say, yeah, it's true that if you very loudly say, I'm not a feminist or I'm an anti-feminist, that you are deliberately antagonizing a whole lot of women in whatever area you're working in who will not like it and will not like you. But I say that a much better route than going and pretending to agree with them when you don't is just to not talk about this stuff at all, to focus on being a really good and successful employee or contributor, to be a team player. And then I also do advocate finding people that you sense are also not on board and allying with them. I mean, most obviously, one of the most noted negative effects of Me Too is that males are now very reluctant to mentor females. And actually, the evidence on this came from feminist researchers say, oh no, now men don't want to mentor anymore, right? And the obvious reason is they are afraid. And what I tell my daughter is try to go and turn down your personal fear dial to make it clear that whatever is true about mentoring women in general, that you are different and that you are someone that has a sense of humor, that wants to get along with others, that does not assume the worst of others. And I think that is at least as good of a route to success, is just trying to find men that are interested in mentoring and make them feel comfortable so they mentor you. I think they're probably better allies overall. And you also don't have to be dishonest. So that would be my overall view. And again, I think you are right that you don't want to be a lightning rod for negativity. You don't want to deliberately antagonize people. But, I think the real secret to success in work is you'll keep your eyes on the prize. There are a few people who manage to succeed purely by being political, but there's way more people who want that job of being the commissar than there are commissar positions. So better to try to excel and make friends.
Yeah, we all cannot be Ann Coulter, is the long short of that, I think.
I mean, that's probably an easier slot to get because there's not that many right-wing women fighting for that job. So again, maybe for that one, there's like 10 women who want it for every slot. I think for being, say, Naomi Wolf or Naomi Klein, there's probably like 100 or 1,000 women who want that job for every such job.
So I want to go back to that fear. Maybe fear is a strong word, but like the
My
abundance.
word, I'll use it.
yeah, that men have with like interacting with women one-on-one or professionally. I mean, we even saw that was a very hot topic, the Mike Pence rule, where he wouldn't have take meetings with women alone, I think like after work hours, which I thought that was like actually pretty appropriate. I didn't think there was anything that crazy about that, but that could be seen as like a lack of openness to mentoring someone in that way. And you talk about this in your essay in the book, The Discouraged Suitor, about how an overzealous zero tolerance policy is hampering romance and workplace romance and romance between people that maybe are interacting because they have some professional connection. Um, I think that's a very good policy and practice in general to have almost an asexual workplace, because I think it protects everyone from uncomfortable situations, especially with maybe people who don't have their social radars completely in tune. But it seems like you disagree with that, and I was wondering if you could explain why.
Right. Well, let's see. I'll stick my neck out and say I think that true love is super important. It's one of the very best things in life. And almost any rule that gets between people and true love, I'm going to say, well, yeah, this is true love. I was teaching some students this summer, and when they were saying, look, this is totally unacceptable, and I said, well, what if it's true love? And they were just stunned by the question because it's like, well, there's a rule saying you can't, but what if two people totally love each other? In that case, you're really going to stick with the rule. I mean, like what I would say in general is just like what I was telling James. It's true that if you just go and say that there can be there's a totally asexual workplace, and we crush the slightest sign of anything else, then you do avoid a lot of uncomfortable situations. However, you also crush tons of good stuff, like people being comfortable around each other. And of course, if you crush anything that is the slightest sign of that, then you don't just crush the thing itself. You crush anything that could lead to that thing. You crush anything that could lead to the thing that could lead to the thing. In Jewish thought, there's this idea of fences around the law. We don't do anything that might possibly get us close to doing anything that might get us close to anything that might get us close to anything that would be wrong. It is a mentality where you're maximizing or you're trying to minimize just the bad thing without thinking about all the stuff that you're giving up. I mean, it's true that in earlier generations, one of the main people that people met spouses was on the job, right? And to say that all of those relationships were not actually of great value seems pretty strange to me. You can say, well, they could have met people someplace else. All right, well, it would have been harder. Probably some of those people would have never met anyone. I think a lot of what's going on here is that people are way too focused on people with low social anxiety. And they figure, oh, well, if they can't meet people at one place, they'll just quickly, easily go over and meet them in another place. In the real world, though, a lot of people have very high social anxiety. They are not comfortable talking to strangers. They're not comfortable doing online dating. One of the few ways they could get comfortable even thinking about asking someone out is to see them every day for a long time. Then to go and say, no, that's totally unacceptable because someone might be uncomfortable. To me, it's like, well, but what about the things that you're losing out on? What about the greater loneliness or something? And really is the case. Some people, if they couldn't go and date a coworker, they might never wind up being with anyone. And so
How about
I would say it's a horrible loss.
how about
What was that, James?
I was just going to say, how about a supervisor-supervisee relationship or professor-student? Is that different?
Right. So again, that's one where I know that people are very touchy about it. And I say, look, the idea that this could only be a bad thing is just crazy. A lot of people actually like this kind of thing. It is very common, very one who is above them in the hierarchy. It's not one where it is all just someone that is taking advantage of their higher position to go and emotionally abuse or push someone else around. Very commonly, it is welcome. And just to assume that it's not seems to be a very strange thing that almost no human society actually accepted until a couple of decades ago. When I was talking about my students with this, they were saying, well, there could be a power imbalance. Some people like a power imbalance, right? And when you put it that way, so yeah, well, I guess some people do. It was kind of odd because obviously, as students in their late teens, they think of themselves as incredibly open minded about every possible kind of human relationship, except for a giant pile of relationships that have existed throughout almost all of human history and now are suddenly unacceptable under any circumstances. I mean, my honest view on these things is that really the rules should be pared all the way back down to, is there a specific accusation demonstrable of actual mistreatment, right? And if you don't have that, then say, well, otherwise, then you're both adults and it's between you. And if you don't like it, then find another professor or find another job. I know it's not a popular view, but I didn't write this book to be popular. Again, like I'm always thinking, what is being lost? What is being lost? I mean, if you say that it is not possible, that it is totally legitimate for someone to ever date a former professor, well, there's a whole lot of such marriages. So should we look at those and say, wow, those are people who, despite the fact that they seem to like the situation, they were abused and this was terrible, right? Or you can say, no, no, no. Of course, the ones that we see are the successful ones, but there are other ones that are bad. In which case, yeah, that's probably true. But there's an old saying, you got to kiss a lot of frogs. The fact that there's some bad relationships doesn't mean that it is not a good idea to go and get rid of the thing in general. Just think about how many bad relationships get started in bars. Therefore, no one should have, therefore, we shouldn't have relationships that start in bars. I mean, that's one where, where there's, I'd say the case is in many ways stronger. It's like the people start out intoxicated, they make some bad decisions, they get into a bad situation. It's like, yeah, I mean, I think if someone were asking me, should I meet people in bars? I'd probably say, no, it's probably a bad idea, in my opinion. But at the same time, to go and say, well, let's just go and shut down all the bars because there could be some bad things that could happen there. It's like, that's not good enough, right? First of all, they're adults and they should be able to just make up their own minds about the risks. But second of all, yeah, always be thinking about what could go right. A lot of things can go right in relationships with power imbalances, and it's just a modern prejudice to act like these have to be bad.
Yeah, so I would it be fair to like categorize it as the unknown trade-offs um of preventing such relationships in a lot of different places in a lot of different institutions, adult relationships. Those unknown trade-offs are likely, if not certainly, of higher value than the potential harm that we think that we might be preventing. So like the black box of unknowns is probably better than the black box of like unknown goods is of higher value than the black box of unknown harms that we think that we're preventing.
Maybe, I would just start with how was the world in the past? I mean, we don't have to speculate about what we like things that are totally unknown. We can just say, well, 40 years ago, this kind of thing was normal. Was it really true that men or women were on average less happy with the situation? I don't think there's much evidence that so. We know that there's a lot of very successful relationships that started off in the past in ways that people now disapprove of. So to say so we have that. So on the other hand, of course, there were a lot of complaints that people had about earlier periods. I'm totally not going to deny that. It's just, in a way, I would, there's sort of an economic argument about trying to censor a television channel, which is, if you don't like it, just change the channel. And if you do like it, you can enjoy it for your whole life, right? And similarly, I say a lot of that applies, well, at least similarly to relationships, where you can say, look, if there's a relationship that doesn't appeal to you, then you just say no, and very likely that ends it. On the other hand, saying that it's automatically not allowed means that something that could have been really great for you is then off the table. Obviously, there are people who will say, well, sometimes it's hard to say no. Sometimes it is, but I think that normally that is not so. And also based upon when I've talked to people who know what things were like in the 60s and 70s, As I think I say in the book, like, so I've asked people, like, who were young in the 60s. So what was sexual harassment really like in the 60s? And they'll say, okay, well, there was a lot of stuff that people would consider horrifying today. All right, fine. Okay, I expected that. But what would happen in the old days if there was a guy who was badly bothering a woman? Is, yeah, the normal thing was she would go and complain to her boss. He would tell him to knock it off, and he would. All right. And then what if that didn't work? Well, then you might go, or actually, the first thing is you just tell him to knock it off directly. He usually does. Second thing is you go to your boss, and then he tells him, and he knocks it off, and normally he does. And then last one is, if none of that works, then you find another job. Of course, that might be if the person you're complaining about is the boss. This was not a perfect system. There are no perfect systems. I don't see, though, that this was a worse system than the one we have today. I think it was probably a much better one than we have today.
I mean, there's also a whole like niche market of like being able to sue for various things that are now considered like illegal and like workplace violations. So, I mean, so there are some more trade-offs, I guess, to consider today. I was just wondering, as like a young person who like uses dating apps and stuff, I think that dating apps, you both are like too old to like understand and know this.
Well,
No
I've read research, Patricia.
um, I feel like dating apps, especially in Washington, D.C., are a helpful way for people to like I don't know if you know what the word soft launch is, but soft launch interest in one another without crossing that like inappropriate professional network. So like you could see that you like someone and then they give you the confirmation before you even begin to talk or like ask someone out in person. Does that sound like that tracks with what you're saying? Like maybe that was the market solution to people not being able to ask one another out in their professional networks?
I mean, I would say that we just had a fortunate coincidence, because if you look at the data on how people meet their spouses, if it weren't for online dating, probably we'd just be dying off right now, right? Because online dating has totally replaced workplace dating, which used to be a very big deal. Right? So, uh, yeah. So, I mean, that, we're very fortunate that it's out there. But part of the reason why online dating has grown so big is that we have just crushed some of the other options. For some people, it's probably a fine substitute, but for other people, it's not such a great substitute. There's some people who just do not come off well in a dating app, but who do look better if you get to know them for a longer amount of time. So there's some people where if you work with them for a year, you'll see their virtues, but you would never swipe. Which way do you swipe? Swipe left on people, right? Correct. Good is
Mhm.
left. Yeah, swiping left is good.
No,
Okay.
swiping left is bad.
Oh, swiping left is bad. Okay, then swiping right on someone. Yeah. So there's some people that are just going. People will almost everyone will swipe right on because they don't have a lot of immediate appeal. But if you work with them for a year, you would see their virtues, and those people are having a very tough time. Of course, they don't talk about it because there's so much pressure on people just to shut up about it. But doesn't mean that there isn't a major loss from that.
So, one thing I've been thinking about lately, somewhat random, but it's just this idea of makeup. So, I mean, the libertarian in me says people should be able to wear whatever they want. But then on the other hand, there's a part of me that says it's a little unfair or even a little strange that women are expected to walk around with paint on their faces and do their nails, hair, and clothes and spend all this time on that. I mean, is this just an unfairness that they have to deal with in life, or what's your position on makeup?
I'm not clear that there is an expectation. It's a way that you can go and get more positive attention for yourself, which some women take advantage of and others don't. The idea that this is just totally normal and all women are doing it is just obviously wrong. There's plenty that don't. I mean, I would say that it's true that a lot more women women put a lot more effort into their appearance than men do. It's not that men put in zero; women put in more. If you do basic economics on this, I think it's a pretty obvious reason. A man could go and multiply the amount of effort he puts into his appearance tenfold, and it probably would not help him much in any sphere of life. Whereas a woman who put 10 times as much effort into her appearance would probably find that her life is better in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I would think of this as an advantage that women have, which is just that you have the opportunity to go and put in some effort and then get a result, whereas men don't have that opportunity. And then you can decide, do I want to put the effort in or not? This sort of does go to this question that some people sometimes think of society treats men less, treats men more fairly than women because if there is there's men so often think of women as sex objects and are not seen that way in return, right? And you could say, look, it's just not fair that there's so much more to me than my appearance. Why is that people care so much about that? Point out in the book, this is one of the many feminist complaints for which there's an obvious parallel male complaint, namely that men are regarded as success objects. And this is one where a man could be great in a lot of ways, but if he doesn't have a good job and has no prospects of getting one, then considered to be pretty undateable. When you put it this way, you can say, well, in both cases, the complaint comes down to human beings are superficial, and men are superficially put a lot of value upon looks. Women superficially put a lot of value on earnings. So in terms of which one is more or less unfair, this is actually one in the book where I said, well, probably this is one where women actually have a somewhat better case, just because you can say that success actually is less superficial than looks. Success actually often does follow from having good character traits, such as a good work ethic or honesty or just being or determination. Whereas attractiveness, well, there's some element to that, but nevertheless, it does seem like there's more being successful is more reflective of deeper traits than being attractive. So it's one where at least I'll say probably there's a bit of an edge that I'll give to women for their complaint being a little bit more justified. But
I mean, is this somewhat of a case of two wrongs making a right, though? I mean, if the popular jock in high school gets all the girls, or the successful CEO gets all the girls, should we just say people are superficial? That's the way it is. Just deal with it.
Well, I mean, there's people are superficial and try to not be, right? But it's very different from the feminist complaint, which really does point fingers and say men are terrible, men are being superficial. So you'll notice that when I talked about the definition of feminism, I said the reasonable definition is the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. I didn't say that it's the view that society treats men fairly and women unfairly, because obviously everyone in society is treated unfairly. There's no such thing as a person who receives fair treatment all the time. So if you just said, no, feminism is nothing, it's not comparative. Feminism is just the theory that society sometimes treats women unfairly. Well, then I would say, again, that's a view all human beings hold, because anyone with two eyes can look and knows that there's some women who have not received fair treatment. But it doesn't make any sense to say this is the feminist view, because, well, do you also admit there's a lot of men who get unfair treatment? Well, sure. Then why not just call it the anti-unfairness view or something like that? Yeah, so there have been a few people who have accused me of whataboutism in the book and saying, well, women have a complaint, and you say, well, what about the bad treatment of men? Right. And I agree, if I were trying to say that that women's complaints are totally without merit, that it would be then reasonable to say, hey, just because men have some reasonable complaints doesn't mean that women don't have some reasonable complaints. And I'll say, all right, yeah, all right, maybe they do. Let's take it case by case. But it doesn't make sense for it to be a social philosophy until it gets to the point of or even to call it feminism, unless there's something special and especially bad about the treatment that women are getting. And that's not whataboutism. That's just saying, if you're going to disproportionately focus on the problems of half of society, you really ought to be able to show that they actually have more serious problems than the rest of society.
So do you recommend something like a cost benefit test for fairness?
Well, let's see. I mean, it depends upon what the question is. If the question is, is one gender treated more fairly than the other? Then yeah, then we've got to go and say, all right, well, do what I did in the book, which let's make a list of all the main complaints and let's assess them one by one and try to come to some reasonable understanding of what the net is. Right. On the other hand, if it's the normal meaning of saying we need to do a cost benefit analysis of fairness would be to say, all right, well, sure, it's unfair, but maybe it's justified in terms of cost benefit analysis. There's something to that too, of course. Say, look, like I'm running a business here. I can't I don't care about whether every little thing is fair. I want people to feel like they're treated pretty fairly. But if it's a matter of I'm going to have to give up half my profits so that everyone can feel like their life is perfectly fair, then I'm not going to do it. And of course, in a broader sense, you might say, well, suppose you're paid extra money to put up with some unfairness. Is it still even really unfair? And I'll tend to say, that's a good question. And yeah, probably not. If someone says, well, look, this would be unfair, but I'm going to give you some compensation. Like, it's unfair that I'm asking you to work on your weekend when that's not in your job description, but tell you what, I'll give you a bonus. It's like, well, it would have been unfair if there wasn't a bonus, but since it's a bonus, all right, great. And everything's great. Everything's perfect. And there's not only is it that the unfairness passed the cost benefit test, but it in fact ceased to be unfair by virtue you handled the issue. Thank you, boss.
I wanted to ask about, I don't know if it's always true that women are more attracted to successful men. I think successful is a very that term could mean a lot of different things to different people. Like a farmer in Iowa that owns land that has a take-home income of $50,000 a year because he has land, and it's a very like socially valuable thing. Like where I live in Iowa sometimes, like half the year basically. That success is very relative, and I think that's also what's like overlooked is also like genre of like beauty in men and women is like very overlooked. So do you think that maybe would be helpful? That would perhaps like make, because I was a little annoyed when you were like men, like women are attracted to more successful men. Like I don't even know what successful means. Like it's hard to get a definition of that.
So of course, I never said always, and that would be a crazy thing to say, right? To say, people always prefer X. I'm like, whatever X is, that sentence is wrong. Even if it's air, there's some people who choke themselves voluntarily. So even that's not true, bizarrely. But as a statistical generalization, the idea that that on average women prefer more successful men prefer more, especially women put a lot of value on success, men put a lot of value on attractiveness. I think that's very well established. In terms of what counts or how relative is it, the answer is, again, it's a mix of the two. So there are some kinds of success that have great social value throughout all of American society. First one, money. All right, it's very hard to find some subset of American society where money is considered a negative. If you really look hard, you could find these people, but they're rare. And the other one is actually fancy educational credentials. Like almost in every subculture, being more educated is considered better than being less, and going to more prestigious schools is considered better than going to less prestigious schools. But then on top of it, of course, you're right. There's a lot of other kinds of success. There's people that regard some kinds of jobs as being dirty or low. So, for example, a plumber who makes $1 million a year still might be considered less successful than a college professor who makes 100,000 because he's not making his money in the right way, right? He's making his money in a dirty or socially disfavored way. So there's that kind of thing going on. There's let's see, like some other kinds of success. Like there's some people just consider lawyers to be not very worthy people, and so sure, he makes a lot of money, but he's a lawyer. Yuck. Something else that's actually a big deal in dating right now is political ideology. Seems to be more important than ever before in the data. So there's people say, yeah, like he may be rich, he may be a Princeton grad, but he's a Democrat. Yuck, I wouldn't even give him the time of day. So so again, you might consider that to be kind of a sort of success, but there's like being the world's champion Dungeons and Dragons player, something like that. There is a subculture where that counts for something. It's a pretty small subculture. So if you have a very high income, you say, wow, I'm going to be considered attractive in a wide range of subcultures. Other things this is like real niche value, and to most of the world it doesn't count for anything. And obviously the same thing goes with physical attractiveness. There are a lot of differences of opinion about what is physically attractive and what is not. There's also, however, some very strong statistical reliabilities about people do consider and agree on as physically attractive. I remember there's a great documentary from a while back called The Human Animal, going over some things that, at least in every known human society, they're considered a plus for attractiveness. Things like having clear skin. Researchers couldn't find any society where they prefer scarred or pockmarked skin to clear skin. Having healthy white teeth. I guess in Japan there is the tradition of blackening your teeth, but at least almost every society, clear white teeth considered to be more attractive. And then obviously things on body shape like the the V shoulder shape for men, the hourglass shape for women, at least very commonly in almost all societies considered more attractive than alternate body shapes. So again, does not mean that there are not some people who disagree, of course, but this is purporting to be a book where social science plays a big role, and social scientists almost never have any universally true generalization. All we work with is statistical generalizations about what's typically the case.
Do you think that there are any patriarchal systems that are like still operating in the United States?
So again, it depends upon what you mean by patriarchal. If you just mean, are there any systems where men have a large majority of the top positions? Then I'd say like practically every system in the United States remains like that. So yeah, look at politics, still very heavily male dominated. Business, again, the very top levels of politics, top levels of business, top levels of science,
Mhm.
even top levels of the arts are going to remain very heavily male dominated. So if that's all it takes to be patriarchal, then I'd say that almost every area that people talk about is still patriarchal. Which is why I say that isn't really a sensible definition of patriarchal. And I would say that in order for it to really count, it needs to also men in those positions and unearn one where even though men have not actually performed better than women, they still get as a kind of set aside a large majority of the better spots. Right. And that's one where my current view of American society, it's the other way around, even though men are still more successful. But we have a system where that favors women and it leads to a larger share of women in those top positions than they would get in a meritocracy. And obviously, this is a statistical generalization, does not apply to every single case. I'm not saying that every woman at the top has failed to earn it, but I do think there is now a strong pressure for quotism and tokenism to say, look, we need to go and find some women to go and be here at the top with us, otherwise it'll look bad. And of course, the way that you do that is by lowering standards. So yeah, I think now again, of course, if we go to other human societies, obviously, most obvious, clearest case one is like where you have government by hereditary dictatorship, where the oldest male relative gets to be the ruler. All right, yeah, well, that's not meritocracy, is it? Right? It's one where you're just going and picking the oldest male ruler one after another, and the question is never, not even who would be the best dictator out of the children of the current dictator. Right? It's a really high level of non-meritocracy when you're doing it that way. But the question that has been raised, and I think it's a very fair one, is like, right. So, who, for example, are the female composers that have been unfairly ignored in Western classical music from say 1600 to 1900? Right. So, like, it's just very hard to find any women that anyone will even pretend with a straight face were in the league of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, Faulkner, Verdi. Um, Now you can say, why is that? It's a good question, right? There's probably a lot of reasons why there's differences in different kinds of achievements. There's, like if you go to Charles Murray's book, Human Achievement, he has two very interesting graphs. One of them looks at Jewish achievement before and after Jewish emancipation, roughly before 1800 and after 1800. And remember, so Jews, even in Europe, would only be a couple percent of the population. Before Jewish emancipation, Jewish achievement was almost nothing. And then almost as soon as Jewish achievement happens, Jews wind up getting to like 20% of all measured achievements of notable in science, in math, in humanities, in the arts. On the other hand, he also has a similar graph for women showing that when there is a move towards at least much greater equality for women, we don't see the same spike in superlative female achievement. Now, again, you could say there's something else going on, but it's at least the kind of paired graphs that make you wonder. So it can't just be the case that there's always a massive hangover for a demographic that previously was being mistreated. At least some groups seem to almost explode with achievement as soon as you pull the glass ceiling off of them. The other thing, just to mention, which I dwell pretty heavily on in the first essay, is that it's important to remember that men predominate at the bottom of society as well as the top. So again, it is strange to describe a system like that as patriarchy, because so if men are more likely to have the really good jobs, but they also are more likely to, much more likely to be in jail, to be homeless, to commit suicide, it doesn't seem like this is a system that favors men in general. seems like it's one where men either do really well or really badly. It's not even clear why you should consider men overall to be more fortunate in the system, regardless of what brought it on.
There's a I don't know if you've read Richard Reeves's book from the Brookings Institution about of boys and men, just came out recently. Just finished
I
reading
think I
it.
know the thesis, but I haven't read the book.
He at one point he discusses how if college admissions were based solely on merit, there would be far more women actually in top schools than men, and that this suggests there's already some implicit affirmative action going on for men, basically to cater to women's preferences because they don't want to go to schools that are 60% women or whatever the statistic might be. Um, do you think that this makes sense? I mean, should we have affirmative action for men just to give more of the guys a fighting chance, or should we just have pure meritocracy? Whoever earns a place gets it, and that's it.
Probably a little complicated. I think that at the very top STEM schools, they would be very highly male dominated if you did it purely on test scores. But if you go down a tier, then I think what you're saying is correct. In terms of what should be done, say, as long as we have publicly funded schools, then I think that the rule of not having affirmative action and just saying we are going to rigidly admit based upon uh, objective academic performance is the least bad alternative. If we had an actual free market, then I would say they've got a right to do it however they want. There is a reason why it's so common for bars to have different prices for men and women for the cover charge, right? This is almost certainly a profit maximizing thing where they say men have to pay to be here, women don't. Why? Because we figured out we make more money if we do it this way. Because men are willing to pay to meet women and women are not willing to pay to meet men, roughly speaking. Uh, in terms of the fairness of it, it's one where I think you could easily say, well, this isn't really very fair. But again, it's one where you could go and say, I will pay extra in order to go and have the fair treatment. Or people could say, yeah, well, it's unfair, but I don't really care that much. And so I will just live with it. Uh, I think, so overall, I think, it's the kind of thing where when government's involved, just the iron rule of we're doing this by meritocracy because anything else takes us down to a very dark road. I think that makes sense for private businesses saying they definitely have a right to do it. In terms of how big of a deal is it? Say probably depends upon how much is at stake for the cover charge. I think it's such a trivial thing. It's not really one that makes sense to complain about. If it were something or bigger, then at least I can understand people being upset about it. And probably in the end, I would say, well, if you don't like it, start your own business that does it differently.
So we'll just do a couple more questions.
Sure,
do you want to go, Patricia?
Yeah, I was gonna ask. So the Biden administration has a pretty notable focus on getting women to re-enter the workplace and more women to enter like certain positions, like certain STEM jobs, where there's less women than men. Um, you touched briefly on like what are some of the dangers of like not letting the most qualified person do the job, and we casually know like you want the most qualified surgeon to perform your surgery. Like that's a pretty obvious one. But what are some broader like societal dangers to this type of policy being adopted by, let's say, like every private firm even is valuing these social qualities more than these more like quantitative like values?
To start, job performance matters in any job people pay for. I mean, something as simple as food delivery, right? You might say, well, what difference does it make if the food delivery person is incompetent? It's just one meal. Yeah, well, when it's my meal, I care a lot. And if it's a whole system where the competence is low, then I don't even want to order food anymore. So competence is always important. And when you are focusing on demographics instead of competence, that does lead to bad results. Maybe not the end of the world, but should it be the case that we have a regulation unless it causes the end of the world? I think that we should have a different bar for it. I know that James has worked on cost benefit analysis and its rarity in regulation, but yes, cost and benefits do definitely matter. I mean, a lot of this is there's a massive double standard because any job where women are underrepresented, especially if it's high status, there's a lot of pressure to get them in, but there's almost no pressure to ever go and consider men in jobs, even ones that are higher status like nursing. Right? There's very little interest in figuring out ways to get occupations to be more accepting of male nurses or male teachers of young children. Uh, on the one hand, I say, just the common sense advice of keep an open mind and judge people on their merits. That's great. But if you go forward and say, and if you're not getting 50-50, then obviously you didn't have an open mind and obviously you didn't judge people on their merits. Like, hold on here. Um, how do you know what I did? Other than having a dogmatic assumption that meritocracy would lead to equal 50-50 distributions, what have you got? In terms of just trying to help people to find better matches for themselves, that again, I say makes perfect sense. The idea that everyone is already perfectly matched to the ideal job for themselves is crazy. It's a complicated world. People are always finding new and better alternatives for themselves, and that which must mean there's lots of other ones that remain undiscovered. The best book along those lines that I know of, though, is not from the Biden administration. It's this book by Warren Farrell, Why Men Earn More, which just goes through 25 important differences between male typical occupations and female typical occupations, which he talks about not to go and make anyone feel bad, but just to go and make people aware about how they could go and find a better job. So look, there's 25 differences between jobs that men and women typically do. And that he says, first of all, explain the higher earnings. But if you're a woman and you want extra money, you can go and find one of these 25 things that you're willing to go and compromise on, and then likely you can find a better job. For example, STEM jobs pay more. So it's like, well, have you considered STEM jobs? No, I don't like STEM. All right. The Farrell approach then is say, okay, fine, you don't like STEM. That's fine. I didn't know. All right. So, all right, let's try something else. Are you willing to work irregular hours? No, I don't like irregular hours. Are you willing to do a job that is in the outdoors, regardless of the temperature? Okay, yeah, I don't mind that. All right. And then Farrell says, all right, well, then I've got an opportunity for you. There's a bunch of jobs that pay extra because they're outdoors and they're not comfortable all the time. And you can make some more money by switching over to there. Of course, what the book is interesting is that it works for men as well. Men can go and say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that I have been focusing so exclusively on money and that there's a bunch of other jobs that I could do that pay less but give me better life, a better quality of life. Honestly, I think when people read the book, a lot of what they'll realize is I was taking it for granted that things were so much better for other people and that I had it very badly. And now I understand that a lot of the reason why I'm dissatisfied is that there's some offsetting good things that I have. But again, of course, you may also realize, oh, okay, I didn't know that I could go and have this kind of job and that was open to me and I could make more money with that.
One question I have is, we were on a panel together at the Cato Institute recently talking about regulation and populism. And one of the points you made that really resonated with me was just about how libertarians need to be more welcoming and friendly and smile more. And, we have a tendency to alienate people.
Hi, everybody.
And I definitely agree with that. I think I could take some of that advice myself sometimes. But I just wonder, is titling a book "Don't Be a Feminist" consistent with that message, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. The correct answer is quite possibly not. So maybe I really messed up, and I thought about that pretty hard. Part of what I did is I tried to get a cover that would show the real feelings behind the book. So I don't know whether you can edit in a copy of the book cover at this point. But anyway, but either way, it's the book cover shows me homeschooling my daughter, and we're both happy. And I'm trying to go and teach her what she needs to know to be the best Valley Kaplan that she can be. So I think if you look at the cover of the book, you will realize that the idea this is motivated out of anger or some desire to upset other people is just not true. That's not what I'm going for. In terms of why I did it this way, honestly, the main reason is that I couldn't think of any better title that would actually accurately capture what the thesis is. I could have given a totally different name and then just misled people on what the book was about. But I said, look, I would rather go and be truthful and risk alienating someone than just do a bait and switch. And then they say, hey, this isn't what I bought this book for. So that was mostly my thinking. Honestly, a lot of the theme of the book is, I'm not angry at people for being feminists. I'm saying that the view is mistaken and you should just apostatize from it if you already belong, or you should just not convert if you haven't done it yet. I don't see that as being inherently unfriendly, just to say, look, there's a view that's mistaken. Again, of course, if I were abusive, it would be a different matter. I'm not abusive. Right? So I'm not there to go and yell at people. I guess I have what you could consider some unkind words for feminist elites, where I do think that, as I say in the book, that they are going and heavily pushing self-pity and anger and are treating men especially unjustly, but also just all critics unjustly. But again, like, nothing would make me happier than for them to read the book and just say, uh, that was very convincing. You've changed my mind. Can we be friends? And yeah, like, if that ever happens, I will go and buy lunch for whoever changed their mind. So, immediately, even if someone didn't change their mind, if they just said, I want to go and talk about it, I'd be totally happy to do that.
All right, one last question. This is a tough one. What's your favorite Morrissey song?
Oh, wow. Yes. So I didn't know that you knew I was a huge Morrissey fan.
It's in your book in one of the chapters.
I think it's the last
Yeah. Oh yeah.
chapter or
That's
something.
right. Oh, gee. Um, hmm.
Maybe I stumped you on
There's
this one.
so many good choices. Um, I'm tempted to start with Trouble Loves Me. Yeah, so I like that one a lot. So Alma Matters. I like that one has some very 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 nice economics in it if I'm remembering the lyrics correctly. Because let's see, let's see. Wait, hold on. Is that the same song? I'm getting nervous. I'm getting nervous actually. That let's see. No. Actually, that's the same song. Yes, the correct title is Alma Matters, and Trouble Loves Me is one of the lyrics. Let's see. So that one is up there. Let's see other ones that are really good. Actually, I now remember the one that I actually love the most is the last of the famous international playboys.
Good choice.
So that's the one where as soon as it comes on, oh yeah, this is great. I can't help but sing along. And then if you know the background of the song, where it's all about the Cray brothers, there's the there's there's and then there's a great movie about the Cray brothers starring what is it, Tom Hardy, playing a double role. So that one that's very very cool as well. Um, let's see, but yeah. So
Yeah, that's
I
great.
will go with the last of the famous international playboys. Great song. You
That
a fan
sounds
too,
good.
James?
Yeah, I like the Smiths a lot. When I used to play in a band, and people often compared us to the Smiths because the singer was kind of a crooner. So,
Great, and I also like Morrissey's more recent albums. I saw him perform live about 5 years ago, and he likes to do almost all new songs, which at the time I actually hadn't heard them. I'm like, huh, I don't know. But then I got the albums. Like, no, I was wrong. They were great songs. I just wasn't ready for them. But now
mhm.
that I've heard them, let's see. So yeah, like on one of the, I think like one album ago, there's actually the one where he sings, I recommend that you stop I recommend that you stop watching the news because the news contrives to frighten you, to make you feel small and alone, to make you feel the world isn't your home. So yeah, Morrissey's anti-news, just like me. That's great.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan, for spending an hour with us talking about your new book. It's Don't Be a Feminist: Essays in Genuine Ethics. Everyone
Great,
should go
Genuine
check it out.
Justice. And
I'm
by the
sorry,
way, see,
Genuine
so
Justice.
you can get the book on Amazon. It's $12 for the paperback, $9.99 for the ebook. And despite record-setting inflation, I have not raised the price. So buy now.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Bryan.
Thank you. Great pleasure.